I'm the director of Vocations for the Diocese of Des Moines. This past year, Bishop Bullock has appointed me full-time in this work. In the past, I've always had a parish assignment in addition to working in the chancery. But because of the importance of this work, he has asked me to work full-time. So every Sunday, I'm in a different parish, talking to a different group of people in our diocese about raising consciousness among our people about the need for priests and sisters and deacons, brothers in our church. It's not real popular work being a vocation director today. We just don't have all these wonderful candidates breaking down the doors wanting to be priests or wanting to be sisters. Some of my priest friends say to me, "I'm sure glad you have that job. I don't want to get up and talk about this every week and have people laugh at you or people turn their faces or whatever the case may be." You see, being a priest today in a parish is the only job in the whole world where 100% of the people love you. 50% love you when you come to a parish, and 50% love you when you leave. We are a very critical people in church today. You know, we have people who are good Catholics who don't like their pastor, and they tell them. We have people who are good Catholics who don't like the bishop, and they tell him. We have people who are good Catholics who don't like the Holy Father, and if they could tell him, they would tell him too. We are liberals and conservatives, and we fight in the back of church, and then I say, I want you to think about being a priest. I want you to think about being a sister or a deacon or a brother. I like being a priest. I really can't imagine doing anything else with my life. I have 4 brothers who are married and they have children, and I see what my brothers have to do day in and day out, week after week, year after year. I could never do that, and maybe that's part of God's providence. He calls us to a way of life, and somehow He gives us the grace to live that life. I like being a priest. What you're going to hear today about vocations is from my perspective as priest. That does not mean I do not support and promote other areas of vocations in our church, but I'm a priest, and my experience probably tells me most about what this is all about. There are lots of gifts to priesthood, and we sometimes don't hear that very often. Probably the greatest gift is we get to know people very well. And for the most part, that's a gift. You know, I'll bet you Father Kinkle knows more about you than some of you wish he knew. You know, from this perspective alone, in a community this size, he knows the people who are here on weekends and who aren't. He knows the people who always come late, the people who always leave early. He knows the people who sleep during his homilies. And after a while, he gets in a community this size who are here because of the gospel. Because the gospel makes a difference in the life and the world we live in. A priest gets to know people very well. Maybe an example in my own life would be appropriate. I got to know this one family very well in a place that I worked. And it seemed like the entire life of this family evolved around an old man that everybody called Grandpa. Now, I had been at their home so many times and heard the word Grandpa so often that I called him Grandpa too, and he loved it. Grandpa was a 72-year-old retired farmer. He had a trinity of beliefs. Every Catholic should have a trinity of beliefs. The first person in this old man's trinity was absolutely the church. It made no difference who the priest was. It made no difference what the sisters were wearing. It made no difference what the Pope was saying. He was loyal to the doctrines and faith of our church. The second person in this old man's trinity was the price of hogs and the price of milk. He was a farmer, and you have to have your roots on a farm maybe to really appreciate that. And the third person in this old man's trinity were his kids, but particularly his grandkids. I was there the day they brought home the newest little grandson, and I watched that old man hold that squawking little baby, and tears came down that wrinkled, chiseled old German face. To share that intimately in the life of another is really a gift. And I was at a graduation ceremony where his oldest granddaughter graduated. He was so proud when she walked up to the stage to get her diploma. And later he said, "I never had a chance to go to school. I never understood," he said, "why young people today took education for granted and didn't work hard and didn't want to do all that they possibly could do." Well, I got to know Grandpa very well. And when he got sick, I was called to the hospital to anoint him. He was going to have exploratory surgery. The doctors had found a mass in his lung. And I gathered that morning with his family and his wife, and we prayed together, and I anointed him, and I gave him the Eucharist, which was central in his life, the presence of Jesus in the Eucharist. And you have that lump in your throat when you're with people that closely. And they wheeled Grandpa away, and I waited with them for almost 5 hours. And finally, a doctor came, and the doctor said that there was a malignant tumor, part of which that they removed in surgery, and the other part would continue to grow and eventually kill the old man. Some of us have gone through that. We know what it's like to wait for a loved one to die. Grandpa was in the hospital for a long time. He was able to come home again for a while, and it was during that time that he celebrated his golden wedding. And he wanted to go to Mass. He wanted to be in the presence of family and friends in church. And they literally carried Grandpa to church. But I had the homily, and I gave them the nuptial blessing. And we had a terrific party, and everybody danced. I suspect we celebrated because we knew that the next time this gathering would come together would be to celebrate the old man's death. I was transferred that summer to teach at St. Albert's in Council Bluffs. And it was in July when Grandpa's oldest son asked me to stop. He said, "I want you to come because Grandpa's dying." And so I went back to that town, and I went right to the hospital, and there I met a nurse, and they all knew who I was. And the nurse said that he was in and out of consciousness, that they were giving him morphine because of the terrible pain, and that someone was with him at all times because they didn't know when that time would come. And I walked into the room, and there was Grandpa. He usually wore bib overalls, but he wasn't wearing them that day. And all those tubes. And there was his wife and his oldest son, and they looked terrible. They had been there all night long. And I encouraged them to go home, to change clothes, to take a shower, to have something to eat. And I would wait there with Grandpa until another family member came. And they did that, reluctantly. And there I was with Grandpa again, and I pulled my chair over next to his bed, not sure whether he could hear me. And I pulled out my rosary, and I began to pray the rosary out loud. The rosary, because it was the most powerful private prayer in his life. He prayed that every day. And we sophisticated good Catholics don't even teach our children that anymore. For some reason or other, we're moving away from some of that which is very sound in prayer. And as I went through those beautiful words, "Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death," he moved in bed, and he opened his eyes, and he focused on me, and he identified me. That was a graced time. I don't know how much time passed. I suppose 20 minutes, I'm not sure anymore. But his breathing pattern changed radically. If you have been with someone who is dying, you know that sound. I got a nurse, and she said, "Father, call the family immediately." And when I got back from the phone, there was a doctor there with the nurse, and they said there was nothing they could do. They told me when I was preparing for the priesthood and dealing with pastoral things, particularly hospital visits, they taught us that we should be as physically close to the sick and dying as we can. We don't like to do that as Americans or our culture. We don't like to go to nursing homes, and we don't take our kids to see these people, and we don't like to. We're obsessed with being young. But I had to do something for him, and I went up to him and I put my arms around him the best I could, as comfortably as I could, and the old man died in my hands. It's by far the most powerful thing that's happened to me. See, I'm convinced I was an instrument of God for someone who went to God. What other occupation or what, I don't know. I just think that kind of intimacy and graced gift, the best paying job anywhere, doesn't compare to that kind of involvement in someone's life. For some reason or other, I became priest in my own weakness, and some reason or other, God called me to be with this man, and for some reason or other, that man was with me at that time in his life. And one by one, his children came, and one by one, they went to Grandpa, who had given them their lives. I had Grandpa's wake service a couple days later, and I had his funeral mass. I said the prayers over his grave, and I walked his wife 50-some years away from the man she dedicated herself to. And before I returned to Council Bluffs a couple days later, Grandpa's wife asked me to visit with her, and she gave me something. She pulled out of an old brown paper bag a pair of the old man's shoes. I guess that's kind of a stupid gift in one sense. She said, "I want you to have these shoes and wear them if they fit you." I'm wearing them today. I only wear these shoes when I preach this homily. They're 27 years old. They're in pretty good shape because he only wore them on Sunday when he dressed up to go to the Lord. I'm walking in Grandpa's shoes. And I ask myself, am I half the person I could be walking in those shoes? Do I honestly fill the shoes of this man? You see, I knew that old grandpa, that retired farmer, very well. That man was my dad. I walk in my father's shoes. You know, we're very critical people. And sometimes the people we live with and deal with every day are the brunt of our criticism. And in many respects, my father was not a saint. In the classic, you make a picture of him or you pour a statue of him and put him in your church. But he was a good man who consistently walked as a person of God, who taught his children about reconciliation and Eucharist, who taught his children how to pray. He was someone who always had God first and foremost in his life, right up until the end. Now, that true story of my dad and his shoes is one that applies to every one of us. Every one of us. By the very nature of our baptism, we are asked to walk with Jesus, in Jesus' shoes. We confirm that in sacrament, that's what we believe. We're walking with Jesus. How do we do that? Do we honestly fill Jesus' shoes? Are we the best grandpas in bib overalls we could possibly be? Are we the best mothers and fathers, husbands and wives that we could possibly be? Are we the best children that we could possibly be, the best priest? Not comparing ourselves to everyone else in our culture. That's the best that God has called forth from us. And if we ask ourselves that honestly, the next logical question is, what does God want me to be? What's this all about, to follow God and walk in his shoes? See, I'm convinced he wants many to be grandpas in bib overalls. It's part of God's plan that many people marry and unite themselves for life. They bear children because that's a powerful vocation. But I'm convinced, as sure as I'm standing here in St. Peter's Church, that God is calling people to be priests and sisters and deacons and brothers in our church. And for some reason or other, we cannot call forth enough people to do that. What's wrong with us? What's wrong with us? Oh, there are lots of excuses. And I find a lot of those excuses pretty ridiculous. I'm not real shy about what I am and what I do. I have no difficulty at all going up to people and talking to them about the possibility of priesthood and religious life. I like what I do. I think it's a gifted thing. But I hear all kinds of responses, some of which I think are ridiculous. I usually hear about 4. The first response that I get, I would never be a priest or a sister, or I don't want my son or daughter to even think about that, because so many of the priests and sisters are really strange and weird people. I suppose some of us are weird, but some of you are too. Look around in church. You'd never want your children to grow up and be like some of them. I know doctors and lawyers and factory workers who are the weirdest people in the whole world. That doesn't mean you wouldn't encourage your children to follow that kind of life if that's where their giftedness is and that's where their interest was. I think that can be an excuse. The second thing that I hear, and I hear this a lot from high school students and college students, Father, I'd like to be a priest or a sister, but you guys just don't make any money. We don't make any money. I make $570 a month. Father Kinkle makes more than that because he's older. But he's topped out, I think. Haven't we gotten to the point and given the message to our families and our children that material things and money doesn't buy happiness? Our children are bombarded constantly about that's how you're successful, to have things. I think all of us are smart enough to know that many of the rich and famous are the most unhappy people that we hear about. I think that can be an excuse. The third thing that I hear from many is, I couldn't be a priest or a sister, you've got to take a vow of celibacy. Celibacy. That means we take a public vow that we will never marry or have a sexual relationship. Now, can you imagine anybody in 1991 taking a public vow that will never have sex? Where every movie we go to, you've got to have some sex to make it interesting. Where every bestseller that's on our market has to have somebody sleeping with somebody. Where almost every more, from the Golden Girls to whatever, there's all this sexual overtone and it's supposed to be funny. Where we live in a particular country in which parents groups in our larger cities are worried about the fact that their junior high and 5th and 6th grade girls have to worry about virginity. Where we live in a world in which my sister-in-law tapes the soap operas so she can watch them at night to find out who's sleeping with whom and who's having whose baby. Well, then celibacy is the oddest duck in the whole world. You've got to be weird to do that. For the most part, for me, celibacy is freeing. I know you've probably heard that before, but I could never limit myself to one person and to one group or one family anymore. I find it to be very freeing to be involved in many people's lives. Sometimes it's very easy to live this. It's not meant for everybody, I'll tell you that. Sometimes it's very difficult, particularly when we have so many people who complain about church, and it'd be wonderful to go home some night and crawl in bed with somebody and have them hold you unconditionally. Sometimes it's very difficult. But so is being a parent. To raise children in our culture. And if we think we can do that without blood, sweat, and tears, without thinking some nights, why did I do this? It's not easy being a faithful husband or a faithful wife in our culture. It's not easy to be a chaste single person in our culture. See, I think sometimes that response is an excuse. The fourth thing that I hear most often is, I wouldn't be a priest or a sister because I want to marry and I want to have one other person in my life and I want to bring forth life. And at the present time, we can't do that under our structures of church. Maybe those rules will change, I'm not sure. But I would like to look at that response from another perspective. Do we really think it's part of God's almighty plan that everyone who marries should marry? I don't believe that for a minute. You know, when we have our windows open in the summer and we hear what goes on next door, or we go to work and we hear our friends talk about what the old man did last weekend, you call that marital bliss and grace of God? And it's obvious not everyone understands what bringing the gift of life into the world is all about. In our culture, we won't even let life come forth from the womb. There's a priest in Milwaukee who has written a fabulous book, as far as I'm concerned, about vocations. And he says basically, what do Catholics want today? What's the most important thing in your life? He says, and I quote, "Is the purpose of life primarily, if not totally, to indulge ourselves? To wring as much self-satisfaction can?" The great philosophers of history taught that the real purpose of life was to achieve happiness, which may or may not coincide with the satisfaction of our own desires. Sometimes we gain a much deeper self-fulfillment by sacrificing some personal want for the sake and the good of another. And Christians have always believed that the real purpose of life is to fulfill the plan of God for us. And when we do that, we're going to be happy. Fulfill the plan of God for us. We don't like to hear that. It may require that we do something with our lives rather than warm this pew for 40 minutes every weekend, and that's the extent of my responding to God. We don't even like the fact that this vocation director talked too long this Saturday night, let alone get serious about gospel and when are we, as Catholic men and women and children, going to stand up and live that and proclaim that. I'm asking you to please pray for vocations. I'm asking you as parents and grandparents to encourage that with your children and grandchildren. I'm asking you to consider a life of service in the church as a priest or a sister or a deacon or brother. I'm asking you to be positive as you can about church. Priests and sisters just aren't hatched on your back door at St. Peter's. They come from homes and from families where the faith is alive, where the faith in the gospel is first. And then those leaders will come from among us. I have one more story and then I'm all finished. I gave this talk about a year ago at a church here in Des Moines, Mary of Nazareth, and in the front pew was a young man who was a Down syndrome child. Now, if you children do not know what a Down syndrome child is, you can ask your parents on the way home from school or from church tonight. They say that Down syndrome children do not live to be old people. He listened intently to the prayers at Mass. He had a missalette, and he was singing. He was a note off here and there and a word off. He was praising God from the depth of his soul. You know, there are lots of Catholics who never pick up a songbook in church, let alone sing. And here was a kid praising God with the limitedness that was his. And with those wonderful eyes, he listened to the story of my dad in his shoes. And when I served communion and walked around the altar, he just focused on my shoes. It was annoying at one point. And after Mass, I walked out singing, and he came running after me with all that freedom and gusto that those gifted children have. And he came up to me, and he put his arms around me, and he said, "Father, I love you." Then he said something very profound. He said, Father, my mom said I'm going to die soon. And when I die, I'm going to give you my shoes. From the lips of the little ones comes the revelation of God. See, that's exactly what Jesus said to his disciples. I love you. I'm going to die soon, and I'm going to give you my shoes. Follow me, walk with me, fill my shoes. That's what he says to us. As grandpas, as husbands and wives, as children, as priest, as sister, as deacon, as brother. And all I ask is that you walk honestly and fill his shoes.